are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And once again, we have the pleasure of talking about the world around us with Professor Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is an economist and economic historian. He is a host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV on Tuesday evenings. He is professor and professor emeritus, respectively, at New York University and University of Massachusetts Amherst, and his latest book is The Sickness is the System. So first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be here.
I was thinking about your most recent book, actually, because I had a little bit of, as I do so often nowadays, cognitive dissonance while reading the news. And in this case, what it was about was this. I was reading, and this is not for a change, particularly to pick on Joe Biden, but on the news media. The story was about Joe Biden, however. The story said that Joe Biden, for a change, has a series of good strokes of luck that might propel him to and his party to a good November. And they listed, among other things, the passage of several recent bills, certain relief in inflation, although I don't know how transitory that's going to be. But I imagine, you've talked a lot about inflation lately. But then again, in passing, they mentioned something like the COVID situation is under control. And I thought, is it really under control? Last I looked at the statistics, I didn't get that impression. So I paged over, this was in the New York Times, I paged over the New York Times own COVID tracker page, and it said something like, this was several days ago, I don't know what it would say now, but it said something like COVID deaths up 18% or 13% from the previous week, and just over 1,000 deaths per day. And it seemed to me there was a time not so long ago when 1,000 deaths a day would be considered a big deal. And 3,000 deaths in a day on September 11th, 2001 was a very big deal. And yet 3,000 deaths on 3 days is good news. The emergency is over. Good news for the president. We can all breathe easier. And it struck me that something very curious is going on. And then I started thinking about, among other things, I had written a piece myself not long ago entitled America's Health Insurance System is a Mass Casualty Event, because a new report from the National Academy, and then I'll stop my introduction, but a new report from the National Academy of Sciences said that if we had a single-payer health system, we would have saved more than 338,000 lives between January 20th and March 2022, and we would have saved more than $105 billion in health expenses. And it's occurred to me that, your latest book, Sickness is a System, it occurred to me that there's this catastrophe unfolding, and I feel like I'm sleepwalking, or everybody else is sleepwalking through this catastrophe and saying, this is fine. Is my sense of disorientation misplaced? Do you get what I'm driving at?
Absolutely. And let me tell you, this won't come as a surprise, but I think you are sensitive to what's going on. You're seeing it, you're feeling it. You're not joining in the drinking of the Kool-Aid the way you are invited to do by Mr. Biden, among others. I think historians will look back on this age, assuming that there will be people in the future to do such things. They will look back on this age and they will shake their heads, not because it's unusual, but as a matter of fact, because its usualness was so unrecognized by the people of our time. Here's what I mean. When empires decline, when countries that have been, in some sense, at the top of the heap in their region, in their localities, or even on the globe, there is a perhaps natural tendency for the human beings who participated in the ride up to be very unwilling to look at the possibility that the ride is now in the other direction. And I think that's where we are. We are, as a people, systematically substituting the wish for the thought. It's not that we can't see, we can. It's not that we've lost our analytical capabilities. I don't think so. I think that we are being overtaken by a determination not to see what is so frightening, because we do, in fact, understand it. We do see on some level that there is this decline, and so we handle it by verbiage, by talking up whatever shred of positivity we can locate, and there are always shreds. In the worst moments of the decline of the Greek or the Roman or the British or the Dutch or any other empire you might look at, there were positive signs that desperate people could cling to, as with a life raft in a flood. Let me give you a couple of examples from my discipline. If you look at the United States today as an economic system, it is extraordinarily deep in trouble. The levels of debt, government, corporate, private, off the charts. We've never been in such an indebted situation. The level of inequality has been getting worse steadily for 30 to 40 years and shows no sign of stopping, as if the rich can't literally get rich enough, even as they talk to each other about their nervousness at whether this inequality will cause social difficulty. Everybody knows we need to anticipate and prepare for and have a program to handle viruses. There's nothing new about them. We've been plagued by viruses for thousands of years. We just failed on a colossal scale. But instead, we talk the way you quoted a few minutes ago, as though this problem is a solved problem of a vague, distant past we needn't worry about anymore. I mean, every week, and I know this is going to trouble some people, but there's really no way of pretending. Every week, the Russian army moves deeper into Ukraine. We keep hearing about the Russians in trouble, the Russians losing, the Ukrainians valiantly, and all of that may be true. But the relentless movement of the military line is unmistakable, and everybody knows it, and everybody pretends otherwise. I'm reminded of that spectacular song by Leonard Cohen called Everybody Knows. It's spectacular because it was right on when he wrote it many years ago. And if you listen to it now, which you can easily do, you'll be blown away by how well he grasped. So I think what we're seeing are lots of substitutions. And you see the continuum. The folks on the extreme right, those of us on the left sometimes are given to suggest that they are no longer connected to reality. They live in some other place in which there are conspiracies surrounding their great leader, who's the best president we ever had, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they're just doing in their idiom and on their side of the aisle the same kind of pretending other than what's going on that is happening left of center with Mr. Biden. Even the topics are the same, but when they're not, what is similar is this need to cover over a frightening reality with a focus on, well, here's the best example. I could go on giving you the bad news about the economy, but then I could tell you that unemployment rate is kind of low by historical standards. Now, there are special reasons for that. We still haven't gotten back to the number of people in the labor force before the COVID hit. But the official number is around 3.5%, 4%. That certainly is historic. And even if you adjust for the numbers, we have a pretty low unemployment rate. Now, true, a disproportionate number of these jobs are very low pay at the bottom, the Amazon warehouse, the fast food, the retail clerk, and all of that. But so you can see the government latching with great enthusiasm onto that particular number. Even though the evidence about where the working class is overwhelming. We haven't seen a movement to unionize like this since the 1930s, which is a hint. We haven't seen strikes the way we're seeing them now. Large companies, small companies, in between, service workers, non-profits, public employee. I mean, the discontent of the working class, the quit rate of jobs, the evidence is overwhelming, but the government focuses on the unemployment rate almost as if it wished that it could get everybody to focus on whatever is left that's positive so that we drown out all the other information.
Well, I mean, I'm tempted to be flip and say that, in slaveholding Rome, the unemployment rate was probably low too. But the fact is that, if you have a low unemployment rate, but nobody can make ends meet and they're all crappy jobs, you still have an unstable economy, right? And therefore an unstable society. I guess part of my cognitive dissonance, which began with the question of health, extends to exactly what you just described, which is I remain astounded, frankly, at the patience of Black America, of poor America, of working America in general, of how much, in fact, crap they're willing to take. I mean, people are not fools anywhere in this country, not in Appalachia, not in the inner cities, not in the deep South. Whatever they may disagree on, they know they've been screwed. They know that billionaires run the system. They know certain fundamental, in my humble opinion, and you may tell me you think I'm wrong, but and yet, by and large, so far, despite the billionaires' fear and maybe the expectations of some of us, they've taken it, which astounds me, and that surprises me as well.
Well, dangerous as it is in our culture, let me quote what I believe is accurately attributed to Lenin in Russia. His associates came to see him before the revolution. And they said to him, we're losing our ability to stay with it. It's going so slowly. Or to use your language, how do the Russian people take it? This fancy palace where the Tsar lives like an ancient potentate, and the mass of Russian people, literally can't get enough to eat. And Lenin's answer, which is what the quote focuses on, goes like this: for decades, nothing seems to happen. And then in a few weeks, decades happen. Well, I think that's what you're seeing. I'm very confident, as you are, in the mental capabilities and smarts of the American people. From the time I was born in Ohio to this minute, lived and worked in this country in 1,000 different situations in many, many parts of the country. And my sense is of an alert, thoughtful, interested population in large part. And where there isn't that, it's clearly been a very bad education system that I put the blame on. It's not the capability of the people. It's what was presented to them as material to develop their understanding. So for me, I think the issue isn't that they don't understand. They do. They lack two things. Number one, a clear sense of what the alternatives are.
Mm-hmm.
Not the least powerful achievement of the dominant culture in this country has been the notion, and it's been done in other countries too, the notion there is no alternatives.
Right.
Right? Tina, I believe Margaret Thatcher called it
Right.
in England. There is no, we systematically treat the people about what's going on as if there were no alternative. It's the modern equivalent of what in medieval times would have been quickly summarized as that's God's will. So that, I mean, end of conversation. You're not going to do anything about it. You are just a human being. And what's happening is God's will, against which it is pointless. It is pointless to move. Again, let me give you an example from the inflation, but it's in everyone's mind. The Federal Reserve, the leaders of the Democratic Party, the leaders of the Republican Party, and the leaders in our academic world, including my profession, talk about the Federal Reserve program of raising interest rates as if, quote, there is no alternative. If you have an inflation and you want to bring it down, then you raise interest. And anyone who says otherwise is simply silenced or treated as though he or she has lost their mind. So imagine then that I get up, having been trained at the American University, and remind everybody that in August 15th of 1971, then conservative President Richard Nixon ended an inflation by declaring a wage price freeze. He didn't raise interest rates. That wasn't his focus. He didn't make your life difficult for poor people, who, of course, are the ones who can afford a higher interest rate least of all and are therefore discriminated against. None of it. But I have to explain to people what a selective amnesia has erased. It's extraordinary kind of there is no alternative. And the second big thing that has to happen in order for decades to be compressed into weeks, there has to be an organization. People are not going to go out there and try it on their own, not even with a few other workers in their workplace. They are now mobilizing in the workplace to unionize, to strike, and that's already very important. But it's a whole nother step to see yourself as part, say, of the working class of people with an interest as such and an organization that you can credibly believe is pushing and advocating for your interests as against the Democrats and the Republicans who are, pushing for the reproduction of capitalism as they have been doing for over a century. So if you don't have the organization and if you don't have an understanding fairly well distributed of what the alternatives are, then you are going to successfully immobilize your people. But I don't want to leave it at that. You may immobilize them. Just like in a dysfunctional family, you may immobilize the young daughter or the young son. They may not know what to do and they go along docilely. But one day they explode and then they do something awful or horrible to others, to themselves. Who knows? We're surrounded by these events. If you look at the history of the mass shootings of the last 20 years, it's an endless story of young men who have lost their job, lost their boyfriend or girlfriend, and it took them over the edge. What edge? The edge of living in this society breaking down with no alternatives and no organization to become part of, to become a component building for a better situation. I think we'll get them. I think when we begin to get them, you're going to be surprised. You're going to be surprised the way we were when a literal tiny number of people did this odd thing back in the late summer of 2011, setting up tents in little squares like in Zuccotti Park in New York City. And suddenly we had a mass movement. In France, a handful of people protesting an increase of tax on their petrol, on their gasoline, start a movement to this day called the Yellow Vests that nobody can quite get their handle on. And in England, over the last 3 weeks, we have an explosion of a new social movement called No Pay UK. And that movement is, we're not going to pay the kinds of prices for home heating oil, for gas, for all the other basic energy utilities upon which modern life depends. I'm not saying all of these are the solution, but they are showing us that people are beginning to recognize what they lack. They lack an organization. They lack a definition of what an alternative could be. In France, it was, if you want to fund environmental advance, that was Macron's excuse, there are 500 ways of doing it. Taxing the average purchaser of gasoline is a regressive, unjust way, and we won't have it. And to this day, they started this several years ago. To this day, they don't have that. He's afraid to impose it because his government will literally collapse. So they've discovered there was an alternative all along, even though their leaders told them there weren't. And if people like you and me and others explain that Roosevelt used a rationing system so we wouldn't have an inflation, and Nixon used a price wage freeze so we wouldn't have an inflation, as, by the way, many other countries have done, that there's an enormous literature in the library that I can show you that goes through it. John Kenneth Galbraith, one of the best known economists of the last century in this country, wrote a book about how rationing in World War II avoided an inflation in a way that we should use in the future. You know, he got a lot of rewards and awards for the book. I talk to people about it now. They ask me, what book? You know, okay, I get it. The system has successfully kept itself going another few decades by expunging from the record what the alternatives are and how an organization is the, if not number one, then the number two priority alongside of a clear vision of alternatives. You put those two together, and then you're going to see decades happen in a short time.
And you know what this gets me to is reaching out to people who, and I'm talking about the left, the real left, reaching out to people who may not already be, quote unquote, on our side. And I'm writing a piece now about, you may have heard about this sort of online dust up about the Cracker Barrel, the aptly named Cracker Barrel restaurant chain. They introduced a meatless sausage patty. Did you hear about this?
No, please. I want to learn.
You know, the Cracker Barrel it's very aptly named.
I'm familiar.
You're familiar with it. It's basically white, artificial Southern culture. And they introduced this Impossible Foods, which is, you know, Bill Gates and everyone is invested in this meatless meat, you know, product, an Impossible Foods sausage patty, as a substitute for sausage or bacon with their cholesterol heavy breakfasts. And there was an online kerfuffle about it with people saying another woke corporation and then the liberals got like outraged, and it was a big online confrontation between liberals and conservatives, and both sides got a few good zingers in. But I, you know, in my piece, I'm kind of tying it into all the Republicans who are, and Tucker Carlson and others who are playing off the woke outrage at woke corporations, right? Trying to tell us, us, quote unquote, what to do about this and that, whether it's ending racism, as if a corporation could do that. And my point being that, number one of the commenters made a sensitive comment, which was, you're talking about people who are, what they're really panicked about is that they feel their way of life and their livelihood is dying, which it is. And why not address that? But number two, and I guess this is my point, is, help people understand that when they say woke corporation, what they're really threatened by is not the woke part, but the corporation part. And that what they're really angry about is that they know they don't have any control over their own lives. Corporations do. And that rather, they're not really angry about woke. They're not, they're really angry about corporate control. The left should reach out to them and not mock them. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because to me, this is one of the big mistakes. Mostly liberals and centrists make it, but I think the left too could learn a lot about reaching out to, working class, Hispanic workers are increasingly turning to the Republican Party. Black workers are disaffected in increasing numbers from political process because it doesn't, for many people, it doesn't speak to their experience. White workers turn to the Republicans or don't vote. I feel like the working class, a lot of statistics confirming now, are entirely abandoned by the Democratic Party and know it. So, it seems to me the left needs to really reinvigorate its relationship with the working class. And if you agree, what your thoughts are about that.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a tragedy that the left not only suffers, but that the left has a good bit of responsibility for. It hasn't seen what it means for the Democratic Party to have made a decision, or at least large parts of it, and those are the parts that run the apparatus, at least for the time being. They've made the decision that their survival and growth as a political movement requires being 100% pro-capitalist, urging, inviting, accepting, and cultivating donations from the richest people and the largest corporations in the country, competing directly with the Republicans on the grounds that they can and will do more for those corporations than the Republicans. That is a big challenge to the Republicans, because if the Democrats were to succeed in doing that, then the need for the Republican Party disappears, because the job of the Democrats has traditionally been to create a bond between the capitalist system on the one hand and lots of marginalized groups of people, workers, white or black, African Americans, Hispanics, women, all the people basically, to make a long story short, given a second-class status. And the Democratic Party represents itself as their champion, their vehicle to overcome their marginalization. Okay, to make an alliance between the corporations who are dominating this system and the victims of the system is a tall order. And the Democratic Party is a mixed bag in terms of how it pulls that off. But by the way, the same thing parallel with the Republicans. They are, again, an alliance between corporations that use the Republicans to reproduce their needs and take care of their needs. And they gather a differently marginalized population, those who are very religious in a society that isn't anymore, those who are holding on to their whiteness in a society that isn't receptive to that kind of thing the way it once was. All of those kinds of marginalized people, those in love with their guns, those in love with a variety of things, they feel excluded, which they are, and they cleave to the Republican Party, which constantly, even if only symbolically, nods in their direction. Yes to your guns. Yes to your refusal to allow abortion, or to your fundamentalist religion. So this is wonderful for the corporations. They get to choose between the right-wing alliance that the Republicans offer them, and the left-wing alliance, if you like, that the Democrats. Either way, they win because both of the parties glue themselves to the capitalist system. Well, conclusion. If the party is too willing to sacrifice the support for the marginalized to keep the donations, then the people who are marginalized are going to have to make a choice. You can see it in the Republican Party. They've chosen that one part of them chose Trump, and they're working very hard to build and to grow their control over that part of the Republican Party. The rest of the Republican Party, those comfortably allied with the corporation, look in horror at what the Trump people do because they know after a certain point, more and more corporations will abandon them, and then they won't have the money, and it'll default go to the Democrats. The Democrats are in the same situation because their angry constituents, the marginalized workers and so on, are just as you said, RJ, disgusted with what the Democratic Party has betrayed in them, promised them all kinds of things, not only couldn't deliver what was promised, couldn't even hold on to what the New Deal achieved for them almost a century ago. So they're ready to bolt. That's why you have Bernie. That's why you have AOC and the bevy of progressive Democrats contesting for election all over the place. And so these are straining the whole game here. And I think, for me, the best possible outcome would be for these things to split. Let us have what Europeans have, not two parties, 4 or 5 or 6, which is the norm, by the way, in Europe. You know, the Europeans are proud of having multiple parties. Their argument is, aren't we wonderful? We give our voters freedom of choice. You poor American slobs, they write to me, you seem to think 2 is a magic number and nobody should have any choice beyond the 2. We find that somewhere between retrograde and Neanderthal. Ha 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 ha. You're the big champions of democracy. But you know, joking aside, they're quite right. And I think what we need is to stop the charade. It's falling apart anyway. The anger and the bitterness are on display everywhere. The Trump people are as enraged against those they call rhinos as they are against the Democrats and the liberals. And the progressive wing of the Democrats is disgusted by the behavior of Biden and all of those folks more and more each day. The bill we've just seen this last week, you know, the bill that was originally supposed to be a solution for the climate and half a dozen other subjects, $3.5 trillion down to $700 billion. That's an 80% reduction in what you were doing. You know, public option healthcare off the table. Vague comment about negotiation between Medicare and the drug companies, how long it'll take, how serious it'll be, who the heck knows? The carried interest loophole, which is the only way most of the billionaires today that are billionaires got that way, instead of being plugged, is preserved. And then we are told that the 100 senators in our leading chamber are being held at hostage by a woman from Arizona. I mean, the credulity, asking us to believe this nonsense is what is, in the end, foiling their very effort. They're trying to hold together an explosion. I don't think they'll be able to do it. And I welcome the need for an American left to find a new political home, a new way of expressing itself that isn't constantly forced into quote unquote compromises that are genuinely, if you're going to be honest, utter cave-ins relative to what the country needs.
Well, I think that's as good a place to wrap up as any. We have our work cut out for us, and but I remain an optimist.
Me too. Me too.
So, and we'll end on that note. Richard Wolff, host of Economic Update, economist and economic historian. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, even in these chaotic times. So, as always, thank you for coming on the program.
And thank you, RJ. Chaotic times need these conversations even more than the more placid. Remember that famous line, be careful lest you live in interesting times.
Right. And I'll give you one more Leonard Cohen prophetic quote to live by, one we're trying to change. Remember, he said, I have seen the future, man. It's murder. We're trying to change that one. So I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Take care.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.